So there are two types of databases which are still relevant. We have the relational databases and we have NoSQL databases. When we design a relational database, we just follow the rigorous, well-established process. Okay, so there's just one standardized process for designing a relational database, any relational database, whether you are designing a human resources system or an ERP database, right? Doesn't really matter. We follow the same rigorous standardized process. But when we design a NoSQL database, it's not one size fits all. We don't really have a standardized process, a single unique standard. How do I say that? We don't really have a one standardized process for designing a NoSQL database, any NoSQL database, each and every time, right? We don't have one process that we can just apply. Each and every time, there may be some differences when we design a NoSQL database. Though the overall process at a very high level is pretty much consistent, but the details that we need in designing a particular database will vary from case to case. Just keep this in mind. And when we previously talked about the database design process, we said we had 3 stages, right? We had the conceptual stage, we had the logical and the physical stages. So altogether, conceptual, logical, and the physical. Now, we are talking about the same thing. We are just using different terms. Okay, so when we design a relational database or a NoSQL database, we still have 3 stages, but we are using different terms. We are a little bit more specific, and these specifics indicate the steps that we need to go through when we design a database. And these steps are commonly used in industry. So I want to go over the process for designing a relational database first. So we have 1, 2, 3, create an application workflow, design markup screens, and identify data we need to display on each screen. 1, 2, 3, make the conceptual stage. Okay, you want to do the translation. This is how we do it. And at the conceptual stage, our primary focus is about gathering the data requirements, right? So it's about put the data requirements in writing. With designing a relational database, we will create our initial model at the end of the conceptual stage. So 1, 2, 3 cover most part of the conceptual stage. Number 4 is the starting point of, well, it's the end of the conceptual stage, right? So number 4 is the end of the conceptual stage. We will create our initial model based on the data requirements. Then we move on to the logical stage because we know we are designing a relational database. So the relational data model will be used, and we do normalization, we do fine tuning. And lastly, we will select a platform to implement our design on, and then we will take advantage of physical features such as indexing and the data types. So 4 and 5, 4 is the end of conceptual plus logical, and the 5 is the physical. So that's how we do translation. Once the design is complete, we will deploy the design in a test environment. We will do the functional testing, the load testing. If everything goes well, then we will deploy the design in a production environment. If we see some issues, we will make some adjustments, right? So once the database is deployed in a production environment, then we are not limited on how we can use the data stored in a relational database. That's a key point. As long as we follow the standardized, the rigorous process for designing a relational database, once the database is deployed, we are not limited on how we can use the data stored in the relational database. Sounds good? Okay, so we are very familiar with this. Now let's see how we design a NoSQL database. We still have these 7 steps, and I want to go back and forth 2-3 times, and I want the class to see whether there is any difference between these 7 steps. Okay, so this is for designing a relational database, and this is for designing a NoSQL database. Again, relational, NoSQL. Is there any difference? Did you see any difference? You see, describe queries or how to use the data is step number 7 for designing a relational database, right? But when we design a NoSQL database, it's number 4. It sounds very ironical because we need to know how we are going to use the data before we even have a database, right? The database is not deployed yet. We're just designing the database, but we need to know what queries that we need to run against the database which we're still designing. But this is important. So when we design a NoSQL database, the design process is based on the queries we need to run against the database once the database is deployed, or it's based on the data usage pattern. So we still do application workflow, markup screens, find out the data we need to display on each screen. 1, 2, 3 is about data requirements. And these 3 steps cover the entire conceptual stage. We need to figure out the queries or the data usage pattern before we can create our model. Therefore, the creation of the initial ERD is delayed a little bit when we design a NoSQL database. We're not going to create the initial ERD until at the logical stage. Okay. So this is the logical stage. And then we will select a platform on which we will implement our design. Pay attention to keys. That's the physical stage. For NoSQL databases, in addition to having primary keys, we also have partitioning keys, right? Lastly, we will do testing and then deploy the database in a production environment. And it's very, very important to keep in mind when the database is deployed, we are going to use the database as promised because we have told the database management system, these are the queries we will run against the database. We have signed a contract, so to speak, right? We have an agreement. Once the database is deployed, you will abide by that contract. If your business requirements have changed, most likely you will need to redesign your database. You may need to create some other tables. Okay, just keep this in mind. Very, very high level. And we are going to walk through one implementation of this process for designing a NoSQL database. So this is an implementation of the NoSQL design process we just went over. Remember, the process is based on the queries that we have identified or we will identify at the logical stage, right? In other words, the design process is based on the data usage pattern. And here are the 7 steps. We will see how we implement these 7 steps. First one, create application workflow. Okay, so I have a very simple application workflow here. This is for a website. A customer has arrived. We want to know whether it's a return customer or a new customer. If it's a return customer, then we will ask the customer to log in. I'm pretty sure the customer will log in. And then we need to decide when the customer logs in, what the customer will use, right? Whether the customer will log in by using his email address, customer ID, username, or something else. So that will need to be decided, and that's the business requirements. Usually we will identify the business requirements and put the requirements in writing before we do the design work, before we do any implementation, right? So if it's a return customer, we will ask the customer to please log in using the email address, and we will display the customer's contact info and then ask the customer to please validate the contact info and to update it if there's a change. We also want to display the customer's most recent order. So this is the screen for a returned customer. If it's a new customer, then we will welcome the new customer and ask the customer to please create an account. Okay, so this is the application workflow. So application workflow, also we will create markup screens based on the application workflow, because when the application runs, this application workflow reflects the logic, right? Logic of the application. So the application will be going from one screen to another. And I have a markup screen for a return customer. So we will ask the customer to please log in using the email address. We will display the customer's contact info and then the most recent order. So this is a markup screen. On this screen, we need to identify the data that we need to display on this screen, right? So application will reach this screen, and this is a markup screen. On this screen, sorry about the interruption. And on this screen, we know what data we need to display. So go back to our process. Application workflow, markup screens. We know what data we need to put on a screen. Next, we need to describe the queries that we need to run to get the data so we can put the data on a markup screen, right? So I'll go back to our implementation. Because we want a customer to log in using a customer's email address. So we are going to look up a customer's profile, including the contact info, using a customer's email address. We also want to retrieve customers' orders by using the customer's ID. So these are the queries that we need to run so we can get the customer's contact info and the most recent order to display on that particular markup screen, right? Go back to the process. So we are at number 5 now. We have the details for creating an entity relationship diagram. Now we will create a diagram. If we use Cassandra, then we need this customer table to have the email address as the PK, as well as the partition key. Okay, so this email address will be the partition key as well as the PK. And then for orders, we will look up a customer's order by the customer ID. Customer ID alone is not unique enough to function as a PK. Therefore, we need order date as well. Okay, or order ID, whatever, you can just decide the PK according to your business requirements. For this particular combination, customer ID and the order date, this will be unique because this is date and time. Okay, so just for info. For MongoDB, we will do embedding because we want everything about the customer, including the customer's contact, as well as the orders. So we will do embedding, but we will use the email address as the partition key. The primary key will be assigned by the database management system when a document is created. So go back to our process. So we have the ERD here. Now we are ready to implement the design. Okay, we need to write some code to implement the database. For Cassandra, we are going to look up the customer's profile, the contact info, using email. Okay, so this will be the PK as well as the partition key. For customer ID, we have, for customers' orders, we have this, right? Because our business requirement dictated that we look up a customer's profile, contact info by email. So we have to make this the partition key. And this is also unique enough to function as the PK. So this is how we create the Cassandra tables based on this ERD, right? And this ERD was based on prior steps. If it's MongoDB, then we will use email as the partition key. Simply speaking, the entire design process is based on the business requirements. Very specific business requirements, such as you are going to look up the customer's contact info by using the email address. Okay, specifics like that will dictate what queries, how you are going to write up your query, how you are going to return, what data you are going to return by running your queries, right? So that's the reason why we say the NoSQL database design process is query first. Think about the details, okay? Also, it's based on the data usage pattern. The data usage pattern, for example, looking up the customer's profile, customer's contact info by email address, those are based on the business requirements. So we went over the design process for a relational database as well as for a NoSQL database. And we went over the implementation of the NoSQL database design process. Does anyone have a question? We are going to look at some other details which will clearly demonstrate to you why it's query first, why it's based on the data usage pattern. But so far, does anyone have a question? I'm going to pause here for 5 seconds to see whether you may come up with a question or you have any comment to share.